the most striking thing about India and China that most people either don't realize or can't even get their heads around because the magnitude is so large is the size of their populations. China has the most people in the world, 1.4 billion. India right behind it. If you want to get to the country with the third highest population in the world, you have to go all the way down to the United States of America at only 300 million people. So China has over 1 billion more people than the third country. India has over 1 billion more people. Between the two of them, they have almost 3 billion people. There's only 8 billion people in the entire world. Almost half the population of the world is either Indian or Chinese. So when you're looking at just the magnitude of these two countries sitting right beside each other, and then understand that this huge size is not because these countries are loose federations of many far-flung different peoples and countries all kind of conglomerated together. No, these are fairly coherent countries with long cohesive histories and a single through line running through. They're some of the oldest civilizations on Earth. So when you look at these two massive countries with such histories and such massive populations, the term you have to look at is underperformance and untapped potential. The fact that Canada, a country that doesn't have 1 billion people, doesn't have 100 million people, only has 30 million people in Canada, and such a young country, the fact that that country can have similar sized economy, similar clout on the world stage to a country like India, there's such untapped potential in these two superpowers. Now, where you start to see the divergence in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, China and India were in a very similar situation as far as economics and as far as relative power. Now, China's always had more clout. It's always had a seat on the P5, the UN Security Council. So that is a difference. China's always had a little bit more clout on the world stage, but they had very similar sized underperforming economies. Since about the 80s, 90s, 2000s, China has just exploded in growth, and now you have an asymmetry between the two countries. Again, all these similarities, but now China is much richer. So you have China, which is now well on its way to developing its potential, but still more untapped. You have India, who you could say hasn't even begun to scratch the surface of what it's really capable of. And now you have the conflict, which we're seeing. Now, to understand, you got to look at some of the other countries at play, understand where the alliances are and how they've shifted. India and Pakistan always been rivals. Now, the US has never been allied with India very much before. It was always more of an ally of Pakistan. Now, there's different reasons, but during the Cold War, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, India wasn't allied with the Soviet Union. They were always non-aligned, but they were much more sympathetic to the Soviets. Their economic model was much more similar to the Soviets. They were very skeptical of free market Western economics. Now that has changed. Another thing that's changed is the US was always allied with Pakistan, and then during the, I won't say what it is, but during this struggle, the US and Pakistan were natural partners, it seemed. But that struggle did not go well. There was bitter feelings on both sides, and certainly the relationship has become much more frosty. And now the US seems to be moving on from that struggle. The new struggle is now against a rising China. So now Pakistan doesn't seem to be able to help much against a rising China, but you know who can? India, for all the reasons I've mentioned earlier. India seems this natural counterweight to China as this rising regional power. So that has led the United States to pivot away from Pakistan, court India more as a partner, and China has followed suit and courted Pakistan. So now you have this interesting teams that have developed where you have US and India on the one side, Pakistan and China on the other. Now the dispute you see between them over a border, similar to many other disputes you see around the world, you have colonial borders, I think drawn this time by the British, which are no longer really seen as legitimate by either country, but the process of drawing a new border is very fraught. You either have to have difficult negotiations hashed out with maybe many different parties, that's very time consuming, oftentimes does not work, or you can have force and a battle to decide a border. Now, battles to decide borders kind of gone out of fashion for the last 100 years. We don't see them as much as we used to. What you see instead are these kind of cold, low-level conflicts where you see both sides try to build roads, try to build bases, try to change, the facts on the ground, so that even if they never get legal authority by the UN or any other body to say that this is their border, if they just go in and they just create roads and settlements, move people in, they can just de facto the facts on the ground, it's their territory. And you see this has been happening for 40 years in this particular region. Many countries are in a similar situation, and periodically you build a road a little too far, you move a little too troops in a little too far, and then the other country lashes back, and then you get this little skirmish, and the situation just kind of festers, and that's really what you see now. But what's different about this situation, something to keep an eye on, if you look at what's termed the international community, now whatever that means, but I think everyone would agree that as a force has been substantially weakened over the past, you could say even 20, 30 years. Now the high watershed moment of this international community coming into being was the first, we'll say the first Iraq event. And now in this situation you had, the official story is a country that was the aggressor and felt it was more powerful than another country and decided to take land and change a border by force. And you had the entire rest of the international community, all the other countries band together and say, no, this will not stand. This is a violation of international law. They all banded together in a coalition, this broad coalition, and they forced the aggressor country back and kind of restored that smaller country's rightful territory. And you had the first Bush, H.W. Bush, he came out and he said, a very famous line, I won't say it, but he also said, the rule of law, not the law of the jungle. And it was supposed to be this watershed moment for international relations and how countries deal with each other. And it was the end of great power politics. It was the end of countries and borders being decided by which country is stronger. No, borders were going to be decided by international law and the consensus of all countries together. Now, that has continued to some extent, but has been substantially weakened in the past 10 years, 20 years, to the point where it's questionable about whether that kind of consensus really exists anymore. So you have seen this chilling effect of countries taking territory by force, but maybe that could change and the pendulum could swing back. So you could see these kind of skirmishes, which have been in kind of a steady state for 40 years, which countries just building roads, bridges, moving people in, moving troops in, little skirmish, and then they kind of retreat. But you could see actual shows of force and attempts to take territory by force, because there may be the perception that this kind of international community that is going to care about this and step in is so fractured and divided at this point, can't really be an effective countervailing force. And with everything going on, you see this story not even getting a ton of play and a ton of traction. You have to kind of hunt for it. So with the world distracted and with everyone kind of interested in other things, are other countries going to use this to their advantage and take land and territory and reshape borders through force, the way that things have always been for many years? In some ways, the fact that they don't has been kind of an anomaly, just held together by this kind of fragile, and as we see, very, very fragile international community consensus. So seeing if there's the end of that, that's going to be the big thing to watch out for here.